All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started here. This is the weekly Q&A session for August 13th, 2020. And I want to show you my disclaimer and then an overview of the questions, and then I'll hide these notes so that you can see my face a little bit bigger for the rest of the recording. So first of all, important information here. I am Jamie Hartman. I am a functional nutritional therapy practitioner. I do not diagnose or treat any disease, and the information presented here is for general information only. It should not be used as a substitute for medical advice. It's very important that you always consult with your own medical provider before making any significant changes to your diet, any changes to your supplement, medication, or exercise programs. So today I had a number of questions that came in. Let's see if I can, not sure how this shows up when it's on my computer. My face is over this question right now, so I apologize if it is on the recording as well. But the first question was about histamine intolerance. So is the second, and so is the third. So I'm going to kind of talk about histamine intolerance and loop a lot of these things together so that we can cover, a lot of it. It overlaps quite a bit. And then there's a question about reintroductions. Is it common for people to have a really hard time in the reintroduction phase? And, I'll talk about that a little bit. This whole question of is it common is always, of course, kind of in the eye of the beholder, what is common? But it's not, you're not alone if you're experiencing that. I can say that much. Same thing with the histamine issue. And then there was a question that I got on Instagram about limiting sugar that I want to talk about, because that's actually a myth. You don't need to limit your sugar to 20 grams. You don't need to count grams of sugar. There is a 20-gram number out there that I'll talk about why that comes from, but just kind of give some general thoughts to sugar. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen here just so that it'll then make my face bigger so you can see me a little bit better. I'm coming to you from my office. So if anybody watching this is interested in working with me as a one-on-one client, getting some nutrition coaching, health coaching with a nutrition focus is what I like to call it. This is what it would look like. So you join me in my office virtually. We have sessions every week and we talk about your unique needs. You get to talk a lot more, of course, than I do. That's what I try to do anyway, but this is what it looks like. So welcome to my office, as I said. Let me jump into the topics that were raised. So the first question had to do with histamine intolerance. And as I said, the second and the third also did. I think it's first important to just kind of preface that with histamine intolerance is kind of poorly named. It's not so much that you're intolerant to histamine. Histamine is in your body. It's produced by your body. It's necessary. It's a part of your natural immune system's function. What happens when people experience a series of symptoms, a collection of symptoms that we have labeled histamine intolerance, is simply that their body is full of too much histamine and it's filling up, for lack of a better word, faster than their body can process it out. So histamine's normal, but like many things, if you have too much of something, even that's normal, you won't feel great. And that's what happens when you're getting those symptoms of histamine intolerance. Your body produces histamine in reaction to foods that, or substances that it perceives to be potentially harmful. So its response to that histamine or that harmful food is to produce histamine, and it also produces an enzyme that breaks down the histamine. Histamine intolerance occurs when you are getting too much on the histamine side of that equation and not enough on the enzyme. The DAO is what that's called. Enzyme that breaks it down and helps it clear out of your body. And that happens for a couple of reasons. One might be you could have a deficiency in that enzyme that's produced to help process it. And there is a blood test for that. That was one of the questions that was submitted. Is there a blood test to diagnose histamine intolerance? And there is a test to see if you are producing enough DAO. It's actually pretty rare. There is a condition, but it's rare for it to just develop in people in adulthood. It may be a test that's done diagnostically in young children to determine they have this deficiency early on in their life. But it isn't always that useful of a test. It doesn't rule out histamine intolerance. Say you have the test and it shows you're in the normal range, you could still experience histamine intolerance symptoms. But that blood test may be useful for some doctors to consider. So again, what that blood test would be looking for is whether or not your body's producing the normal amount of DAO, the enzyme that breaks down histamine. It's important to remember that histamine intolerance is not an all or nothing thing. So the question was asking about, like, I looked at that list. The list is so many things. It's like everything I eat. You don't have to eliminate all of them. It's not like the AIP approach where we are going to eliminate all those foods to get a clean slate. All those other foods, those foods that are on the histamine intolerance list, are all healthful foods for the most part, if they're within the AIP bounds. But eating all of them at once might cause your body to produce and have too much histamine that it can process. People will talk about it being like a cup or a bucket that's overflowing. If you can make the bucket bigger by increasing your body's capacity to manage that histamine and process it out, break it down, that's the best way to address histamine intolerance. And in the meantime, you can address histamine intolerance by reducing the amount of histamine containing foods that you eat. Rather than thinking about that specific long list, because people will see on there like, oh, avocados and bananas and spinach, like these are all healthful things that I want to eat and they're all AIP foods. What if I have to cut them all out? There's nothing left. Instead of thinking about all of those, there are two things that you can do to start with if you are experiencing histamine intolerance. And one is that for now, temporarily, forget about eating all those healthy probiotic fermented foods that we talk about in the AIP world. So those are, again, healthy foods. But that bacteria, those good bacteria bugs that ferment food to make it taste that way and to also provide a probiotic source of beneficial bacteria to your body, they are producing histamine as well. So that's what's fascinating about histamine. Like lots of creatures, biological creatures create it. Your body produces it, and so do those little bugs. Those are the microscopic bacteria that is growing in the fermented foods. So not harmful, but that's what's happening. Bacteria, as it's growing, it's producing histamine. So the more fermented it is, the longer that ferment, the more of that histamine is hanging out. So if you're experiencing histamine intolerance, that's the first thing to do. So you would cut out, for now, sauerkraut, other fermented vegetables. If you were eating like a coconut yogurt on AIP, you'd want to skip that for now. Kombucha, kefir, kvass, any of those good fermented things, temporarily, just skip those completely because they're a big, heavy amount of histamine. The other big change that people can make that, again, doesn't require you going through a whole big list of eliminating foods, but that is to adjust the way you approach leftover food. Because again, just like with the fermented foods, where bacteria is growing and replicating and then producing histamine in that process, that's what happens with our leftover food. So if you don't believe me, think about this. Imagine you took some leftover food today from whatever you had for dinner and you put it in your refrigerator and then you forgot about it. And you found it a couple weeks later and you opened it up, it'd probably be moldy, it'd be decomposed, it'd be pretty nasty because that bacteria was growing. Well, that bacteria was growing earlier too. It starts right away. It's naturally there. Again, it's harmless. It may even be beneficial at the low levels. But even at the low levels, when that bacteria is growing, it is producing and releasing histamine. That histamine is just hanging out in the food when you eat it. And cooking, it's not, heating it up again, it's not going to change that. It might kill the bacteria that's lingering there, but it won't remove the histamine that was produced. So if you eat that food after a couple days and it's had some histamine building up in the time that it was sitting in the refrigerator, it's still, again, it's a safe food otherwise, but it might make you feel uncomfortable, get some of those histamine intolerance symptoms to pop up. So how do you avoid that? Well, one, you can cook from scratch, cook fresh every day. I get that's not always easy. If you're cooking for a large family, you might do that anyway because, you don't have leftovers. That's the benefit, I guess, of it. But if you're like me and you're cooking for one or two people, leftovers are kind of how you eat. You make a big batch of something and then that's what you have for lunch the next day and dinner and then, another lunch in a couple of days. Or you do batch cooking on the weekend because you're really busy. And that's one thing we really promote to people. And when you're dealing with histamine intolerance, that may not be something that is going to work for you. Fortunately, though, the bacteria that starts to grow in your refrigerator, even after just 1 or 2 days, will not grow in your freezer. Right? So when we think about this, we know this. We can take that packaged leftovers, put it in a plastic container, shove it in the back of the fridge. It turns to mush after a couple of weeks. In the freezer, it's fine. So if you want to prep ahead or save leftovers and you have histamine intolerance, learn to utilize the freezer. It'll make you feel a lot more comfortable. You'll then be able to tolerate those leftover foods. The other way to approach your batch cooking is to maybe kind of rethink how you do batch cooking. So maybe it's more of like a batch prepping. So if you know that cooking up a big batch of vegetables and then having those already cooked vegetables hang out in your refrigerator doesn't work for you, that you get a histamine reaction to those cooked vegetables after a couple days, maybe what you should be doing instead is buying your vegetables throughout the week and prepping them, as you go. Or maybe frozen vegetables are a better choice for you right now. Or you could prep some of those vegetables as long as they're kind of the hardy, dense kind that aren't going to start, having some kind of molding growing on them, early on. You can experiment with that as well. So it's really that histamine buildup starts to happen from the bacteria that shows up on those foods after they've been cooked. So it's kind of a dance. It's not an all or nothing thing. Again, we have to sort of visualize our body as, having this cup or this bucket inside of it that is managing your histamine load. Your body's going to produce some histamine and you're going to get some histamine from the food that you eat. And as long as the cup doesn't overflow, you'll feel fine. You'll have no problems. That's normal, natural. Your body can handle that. If your cup is really, really small, or if suddenly you've changed your diet so that you're eating a ton of fermented foods and you're eating all these leftovers and you're just like bombarding your system with histamine that your body's not yet used to, you can experience histamine intolerance. So hopefully, as I've been talking, you're kind of realizing that this doesn't last forever. For a lot of the people that I work with, histamine intolerance simply improves over time. And it improves naturally without necessarily having to do anything specific, as long as what you're focusing on is eating a good nutrient-dense diet and working to get your autoimmune disease under control. So one of the questions that was submitted asked about, how do I advise people who are dealing with an autoimmune condition and also histamine intolerance? How do I advise them to proceed? And the goal needs to be to try to get your autoimmune disease under control, because likely the autoimmune disease is what's driving that histamine intolerance, not the other way around. So the answer is not to restrict your diet, to cut out all kinds of nutritious foods, but instead to see what you can do to eat a really nutrient-dense diet. I've talked briefly about that enzyme, DAO, that's an abbreviation, DAO. That enzyme that your body produces that helps you clear histamine, that breaks down histamine and then clears it out of your body so it doesn't linger and bother you. You can increase your levels of DAO by giving yourself a good nutrient-dense diet. And one of the key kind of superfoods there is going to be liver. Liver contains all of the components that your body needs to build that good quality DAO enzyme. I've seen a lot of people turn around this histamine intolerance by changing some of those practices around, like eating leftover food, adding in a really good nutrient-dense diet, adding in some liver. They can make a lot of improvement there. Histamine intolerance is also exacerbated if you've got other conditions going on, like small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. So if you think you have that, it's good to try to get that, managed. Get tested, get treated. It's not just uncomfortable. I think sometimes we sort of chalk up SIBO to being like, well, it's like IBS, it's just, I don't, digestive and I don't like it, but maybe I could live with it. But it actually does have some downstream effects. And this is one of them that it can have for people. So if you suspect you have it, get it evaluated and treated. Also just having, in general, what's called a leaky gut can make histamine intolerance worse as well. And so everything we're doing on AIP is aiming to help that heal. It doesn't happen overnight though. But as it does, you will find that over time, you'll be able to tolerate more and more histamine. It's also, important to recognize too, that it's a dance. Some days, some times of the year, in some environments, you may actually be able to tolerate more food with higher levels of histamine than you are at other times, because your body is also producing histamine in response to what's in your environment. And that doesn't just change on a dime. Like if you are allergic to, like, say, a cat, or somebody who is, what that allergic reaction feels like. The itchy eyes, that's histamine. And you know too that if the cat's in the environment and then the cat leaves the environment, your reaction doesn't immediately go away. Or if you leave the cat's environment, I guess maybe is a better way because the dander might be hanging around. But if you encounter something you're allergic to, histamine builds up really quickly in response to that. It's part of the natural response. And then it takes a little while for it to settle back down. That's that enzyme working, to help. So the same thing happens when we're dealing with it in terms of histamine intolerance with our food. It doesn't necessarily just improve overnight, but it does improve without you having to do a whole lot. And it certainly is not necessary that you cut out huge lists of food in order to manage histamine intolerance. I think the most important thing anybody can do if they're experiencing it honestly is to get a good practice for how you're going to eat your meals in a way that none of them are allowed to have any of that histamine buildup. So whether that's cooking everything from fresh, not always feasible, or using your freezer, that'll help a lot. And then you don't have to necessarily go down that whole other path of all the other things on that list. So I think that's pretty much it on the three questions that were about histamine. I'm just looking at my notes again to see if there was anything else there about histamine. So I think that pretty much covered it. The only thing I'd add about histamine intolerance is that if you don't find that you're getting anywhere with it, this is a good topic to bring up with a coach, like individually. Because I've worked with people, who come to me as clients who said, I have histamine intolerance. They're so sure of it because they read a bunch of symptoms, and they, for whatever reason, like that's what they have self-diagnosed themselves with. And when we get to working and we start to work through kind of the symptoms and looking at what's in their food journal, and it turns out that there were other factors at play that they had not yet recognized. And the histamine intolerance was probably not as severe if it was even a factor at all. I never argue with anybody, if they tell me they're sure that that's what it is, I'm going to take that at face value, but I'm not going to stop there. I'm going to look and see what else is going on, look carefully at their food journal, do a whole analysis of their nutritional intake and the symptoms that they're experiencing and their history, and maybe suggest they talk to their doctor about getting some additional blood tests or SIBO tests or so on. But if you're finding that you think you have histamine intolerance and making those two basic changes, cutting out fermented foods and only eating fresh foods, doesn't actually improve your symptoms, then it's time to engage an expert in talking with you about what might really be going on, because it may be something else. Don't ever get too focused on that one track. Okay, the other two questions that were submitted that I want to touch on, one had to do with reintroductions, and then the other one was about sugar. So the reintroduction question, the person was asking about whether or not it's common for people to struggle with the reintroduction phase, and if there are some foods that you just are never able to reintroduce. And and I alluded to this in my introduction, but what's common, is it's hard for me to say. You're not alone. Of course, the reintroduction phase is a challenge for a lot of people. And yeah, absolutely, it is common for people to discover that there are foods they are not going to go back to eating. But that's the whole point. That is the point of doing the reintroductions. You start with the elimination phase, you get progress, you start feeling really good, and then you methodically work your way through the foods that you eliminated that are still beneficial in some other way, and determine which ones you can and want to bring back into your diet and which ones are not good for you to eat right now. So, as you work through the stages in reintroductions, they're set up in such a way that it's meant to stack the odds in your favor that you won't have any reactions early on. We group the stage 1 foods together. They're the ones that, the science and our experience as AIP coaches kind of tell us that most people do actually pretty well with these foods. And they have a lot of health benefits or just kind of lifestyle benefits that make your life easier. So if you can eat them, you should start eating them, stage 1 foods. And we save the foods that most people, again, from science and experience, tell us struggle with, especially early on, to stage 4. Because we don't want you to jump right into something that's likely to trigger you to go right back to where you started. So the question asked about, well, are there foods that you can never reintroduce? And absolutely, there are foods that most people, it's common for people to find that there are some foods that they can't reintroduce. It is not common, however, for someone to find that none of the foods work for them. Then if that's happening, if you are doing reintroductions and you're finding that every single food you try feels like it's a problem for you, you don't feel good when you eat them, whatever that means for you, you have a reaction, you have a flare up in your symptoms with every reintroduced food, that's another time where it's good to talk to an AIP certified coach, because we can help you look at, one, maybe the problem is the technique that you're using to reintroduce the foods. There's actually something to that. Maybe you're missing something in your diet as a whole, some nutrient that's allowing you to be able to tolerate those foods. There's a lot of factors at play. It's not normal for you to not be able to reintroduce anything, but it is also not normal for you to just go back to eating the way you are and maintain your health gains. So what often happens when people start to do reintroductions, or when they do reintroductions, is that they have a lot of questionable foods in the middle. What we would like to have happen is that you get clear yeses and nos. You would like to test a food and discover, yes, it's perfect, I can eat it, I have no problems. That would be ideal, right? I've got this, it's now part of my diet. It's also kind of nice when you find out for sure that a food doesn't work for you, because now now I know all those years I was eating whatever, fill in the blank food, and it was messing me up, and now I know it, so I'm never going to have it again. That's also, people are kind of excited to learn that, even if it was a food you thought you liked, you're like, fine, I'll never eat that again, no problem. Unfortunately, for a lot of people, though, there's a lot of reactions that can happen that are sort of vague in the middle, where you're like, I tried the food and I followed the process, and like the next day I had a headache, and I don't know if it was the food or if it was something else that was going on. And then I tried another food, and now I'm not really sure, because I've tried 2 foods now in 2 days, and I don't know what's causing what. So that's really common. People do that. And they say they have a hard time with the reintroduction phase because it's kind of willy-nilly and everything's really unclear, and they weren't really keeping good records. And they do things like, well, I was out with my friends and I said, what the hell, I'll just have that ice cream. And so I reintroduced ice cream. And that is not a good measure either, because you haven't controlled any other variables. And if you have a reaction to that ice cream, you don't know if it was from the milk, some other ingredient, an additive, the sugar. You just need to be able to isolate things. So that I see a lot. I see that a lot when I work with people who said they've done, the elimination phase, they did really well with it, and then kind of their approach to reintroduction was to just be like, I'm done with elimination, and now I'm just going to start eating other foods. And then it's really unclear. They don't know. They start feeling not good again. They feel their autoimmune disease coming back. They even have a flare, or symptoms return. And we have to go back, get back to baseline, clear the slate. I try to tell people that it's like doing a science experiment. You really have to know what it is you're testing in order to get a clear picture of what's going on. So that is by far probably the most common thing that I see when I work with people. People do really well with a lot of people, I shouldn't say everyone, but people generally can do pretty well with the elimination phase, that quote unquote strict AIP. It's like, okay, I know what to eat, what not to eat, and I just follow the plans, the menus, whatever. But then when they're ready to expand their diet, they struggle, not because their body won't accept any of those foods, but because the way that they're sort of preparing their body to handle those foods is not giving them clear indications. It's also something that happens a lot is that people get scared about what's going to happen when they test a food, and your mind is super powerful. I don't mean to say that like it's all in your mind, of course not, but your mind can definitely interfere with your body and tell your body to get geared up for something and trick you into thinking you're having a reaction to a food. So that's another thing I work with people on, mindset, and kind of controlling all of that. I'm taking a glance at the time. I want to make sure I end on time here. There was one more question, and it's one I can actually answer probably pretty fast. It had to do with sugar. The question was that it asked about, do I have to stick to 20 grams of sugar forever? And first of all, that's a myth. You don't have to limit your sugar intake to 20 grams. In fact, I would even say, you should not eat any refined sugar. I mean, period. Like, we should be striving to have a no refined sugar diet forever. That's what everybody would be healthier at. I mean, that is true, right? We all would do better if we didn't eat white plain sugar. At least most days, you know. So that, forever. You don't reintroduce, chocolate frosting with regular sugar and Twix bars and, all that kind of sugar bomb stuff. We don't reintroduce that. But you can't, AIP is not no sugar or low sugar even. That 20 gram number that gets thrown around about sugars is actually referring to fructose, which is just one type of sugar. And we always hear fructose and we're like, oh, that's in fruit, so I'm supposed to limit my fruit. And in reality, fruit will have fructose in it, but it's also going to have the other sugar forms like glucose. And what we don't want to do is to consume sweeteners that are really high in fructose compared to glucose, because there's a whole host of health problems associated with that, not just autoimmune. And I won't get into that right here. Sarah Ballantyne has a really good post on that if you want to look for that. But the fructose becomes, we worry about fructose because we know in high fructose corn syrup, which you should be cutting out anyway on AIP, there's some health, consequences to that. And then agave syrup, unfortunately, is always kind of presented as this natural thing. It's really high in fructose as well. So we don't encourage agave syrup. We also want you to be mindful of how much honey you're consuming, because that's also kind of high. It is high in fructose, but not as high as those other two sweeteners. So you can have fruit. You can still have like 4 or 5 pieces of fruit. I mean, somebody did the calculation and like that fructose number, if you were to say, this is just an example, eating bananas, you could eat 4 bananas before you hit that number, 4 whole great big bananas. Now, that probably wouldn't be a wise thing to do and feel great about, but think about the equivalent of that in different types of fruit. You can have a banana every day. You can have a couple of blueberries every day. You can have an apple every day. They are all good for you. You can do all of that, especially if you're also, that's like on top of all the nutrient dense vegetables you're eating. So make sure you're getting more vegetables than fruit. That's kind of the little rule of thumb. In fact, the way I usually coach my clients is to say, just think of it to start out with as 6 cups total of fruits and vegetables, but 3 of those cups need to be green vegetables. 3 cups need to be green vegetables. You can't fool with that. Like, you can't sneak in some vegetable or some fruit in there. And then the other 3 cups should be colorful, and they can be fruits and vegetables. So those other 3 cups can include strawberries and blueberries and bananas and apples and oranges, but they should also include carrots and beets and sweet potatoes and squash and, red cabbage and red onions. Like, just get a lot of color in your diet. So if you do that, if you have 3 cups of that and 3 cups of the green, at least to start, you can add more, but that will give you kind of the right ratio, and you don't need to fear fruit or fructose specifically. So again, if you hear that you can only have 20 grams of sugar, that's not true. 20 grams of fructose, but I don't think anybody really needs to count fructose grams. If you did, you'd find out you're coming in under that every day if you're following those basic principles. So you don't really need to worry about it. Okay, that's it. Those are the questions. We're right on time. I kind of earmarked this for 30 minutes, and so that's exactly what it hit. Thank you for tuning in if you tuned in live, and thank you to all who watch the recording of this later. I'll be back next week answering more questions. Bye.